This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 379. Too many people.
One of the most powerful forces reshaping our world is unprecedented mass migration. The wind of change that carried my own parents across the globe in the 20th century was a mere gust compared to the hurricane that is coming.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, that was former British Home Secretary Suella Braverman talking about migration to the UK. She is, up to the right on Genghis Khan in terms of some of her political views. But is she right on migration getting out of control? It's not the boats that are the issue. It's not people illegally crossing the English Channel. The vast majority of migrants to Britain, like 99%, are arriving by legitimate means and staying here with valid visas. So if she wants to stem the hurricane, why didn't she do something about it? Well, perhaps there isn't an answer. So the question for the West, are there too many people? And for the world, the same question, can we keep supporting this level of population? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, last year, net migration to the UK reached 745,000 people. For the 12 months to June, it's down to a little bit, to 672,000. That's 1.2 million people coming into the country, 508,000 people leaving. And most of the 1.2 million coming in come from countries outside the EU. Most are students and healthcare workers. This is, of course, very distinct from asylum seekers, which were close to 100,000 applications made in 2022. So a small fraction of the total that is coming into the country. Immigration has always been a contentious issue, of course, not just in Britain, but it's all over. It'll probably help bring Donald Trump back to power next year. It helped Geert Wilders to gain more votes than anyone else in the latest Dutch election. He got 23% of the total vote. His Freedom Party is seeking freedom from the European Union, even though, or perhaps because he is the son of a former European commissioner. He does want to stay in the single market, though, like Norway. He just wants to escape the bureaucracy of Brussels. And also in the past, he's really won by advocating less migration and advocating the ban of the Quran and mosques in Holland, along with immigration from Muslim countries. He basically wants to stop. He is Donald Trump's soulmate, isn't he? So, Steve, it feels like we are at a breaking point. The political dial is shifting to the right, isn't it? If we had a Labour government in the UK right now, if we have that figure of 750,000 net migration in a year, then that would be a vote winner for the Tories, wasn't it? The fact that it was delivered on their watch is what's stopping that shift to the right here. It'll swing back to the centre for a while, but, it'll be back there because this is going to be around for a while. But fixing the issue seems too difficult for anyone, and it's an excuse for political right-wing parties to gain power, isn't it?
Yeah, there's when you think about that rate of immigration, that's more than 1% of the population, isn't it?
Yeah, 1.1% it works out. Yeah.
Okay, now that's huge. That's pretty much the normal rate of growth of the domestic population, including births minus deaths. So
way more. It's about, in the UK, that's about 0.1%.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If we go back to the 50s, the population rate of growth was about of the order of 1.5% out of natural growth, and now you're talking that's going to way down. But that scale of immigration it has got all sorts of effects, which you can be left or right about it and still say it's going to be deleterious for what the country needs at the time, unless you're filling in an enormous labour gap. So the one time that was done in my own home country, Australia, was during the attempt to rebuild, to improve the country's infrastructure during the end of the Second World War, and masses of migrants from Europe were accepted in, and on the condition that they worked in labour camps, as they effectively were, in building the Snowy Mountain scheme. And so that was something where that produced a local camaraderie amongst the workers themselves with the local Australians as well. And then when their time had finished and they could go back into the population again, there was a it was a cultural transformation for the country, which was quite successful.
But there was a sense of purpose there, wasn't there? I mean, everyone was being brought together. It was sort of like there's a bit of a pioneering spirit. So, I mean, you could see that could work. But, I mean, migration, you make that point, 1.1% of the UK population basically is how big it is now. Australian net migration peaked at 300,000 in 2009. It's still up at 170,000 last year, which is about 0.7% of the population. The US had about 1 million net migration last year. That's about 0.3% of the population. So Britain is a bit of a standout, isn't it? In France, by the way, it's less than 0.1% of the population. And yet you'd think, there's every reason to migrate to France. They've got the Côte d'Azur, they've got Paris. Why would they want to come to Britain when you've got France? But, we've got 10 times the, proportional to the population, 10 times what France is getting. It's bizarre, isn't it, to understand why this is happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd like to see what the details of the reasons for the migration are. I mean, if there a lot of it is probably because the wages being offered to low-paid workers in the UK, and that includes nurses and doctors these days, which is ridiculous, but that's the case. That's so low they've got a need to fill in positions in the NHS and other bodies of that nature. And the students are coming over for what is seen as education when it's in fact a visa exploitation scheme. I saw enough of that when I was in Australia to be quite adamant about that. So it's actually neglect of building your domestic infrastructure that means that so many people are being brought in. Probably, I'd like to know what the breakdown in terms of students coming over or medical staff.
That is basically it. Students and medical staff, by and large, that's what people are moving in for. So what's the student loophole then? Tell me about that.
Well, the student loophole is basically they pay a large amount of money for fees to the universities, and the university which are being starved of funds, and I certainly saw that both in Australia and the UK when I worked there. They're starved of funds, and the easiest way to fill put bums on seats and pay for the Vice Chancellor's extremely high and obviously highly necessary, outrageous salary was to hire as many foreign students as possible. And then, of course, they have the benefit that they push up rents for slum landlords. And again, I'm talking from what I've seen, and low-wage workers for retail outlets, 7-Elevens and so on. So, there's an enormous extent to which this is exploitation on the one side of the migrants coming in. And on the other side, it's a reflection of the lack of attention to building the country's infrastructure and paying. Can I use the word shit on our podcast?
You've just done it. So, I haven't got time to edit it. Yeah.
There you go. Shit wages for people in essential services like doctors and nurses. So, the UK is reaping the rewards of underinvesting in its own people.
So a false economy, really, is what you're saying. But it's interesting because there's talk now about whether they should actually, to try and reduce this migration, they should say one of the requirements if you're coming into the country, even if you are in an occupation that's needed, that you need to have a job secured that is paying at least $35,000 a year, which is a little below the average wage in Australia, which is $38,000, but it's pretty close. The Royal College of Nursing says the average salary of a nurse in 2021 was $33,000. So as well as stopping the boats, they're going to stop the nurses by, or all of a sudden the NHS will have to start paying whatever that base salary to get people into the country is going to be, which is going to inflate the cost for hiring nurses. So I don't know. It seems like twisted logic is at work in a lot of this, isn't it?
It is, and it's the old argument in favour of neoliberalism was that you won't need the state because the economy will grow so much faster, your wages will be higher from the private sector, you won't need welfare, yada, yada, yada. Instead, what we get at the end of it is the rate of economic growth actually halved, largely around the world courtesy of neoliberal policies, and wages and conditions declined because the unions got exterminated in that whole process. So workers no longer had to do any collective bargaining, and therefore they lost out over wage rises versus markup increases and so on. And it's a hellhole. And because you haven't provided the essential services while you still pretend to have a national health scheme, then you bring in cheap labour from overseas to cover it. So it is just a series of catastrophes which began from the belief that everything should be privatised, which we got back from Maggie and Ronald back in the 1970s and 80s.
So do you think if we had stronger labour representation and wages would be higher, there'd be more domestic jobs and less need to take people from overseas. Do you think that's the way it would work?
That's absolutely. That's certainly. I mean, there's much more to the migration issue, and we'll cover that obviously in the rest of the discussion. But fundamentally, a lot of this low wage or student, and often faux student immigration was a product of having privatised the education system in various ways. Like I knew so-called students in accounting programs in Sydney who were being educated by private providers, where private providers existed because of the privatisation of public education over time, and they were learning accounting and bookkeeping and stuff like this, and there was no way they were working in those industries. There's no way they'd get a job in those industries. It was just to make the migration from where they had their own personal reasons for wanting to be in Australia, a higher wage on average than they would have got in their home countries, talking of migrations from some of the poorer countries in Southeast Asia. So that was the motivation. But then they put up with this whole experience so that they could get their visa. And so it's a visa farm system. And I imagine a similar thing applies in the UK as well.
It's interesting how, people voted for Brexit. Well, not all of them, but, I think a significant number were people who were seeing lower wages, their jobs basically being undercut by foreign workers. And so they wanted to see less foreign workers, hoping that would see their wages go up. It doesn't seem to have worked that way, does it? In fact, now we're taking more people than ever before because we need them for jobs that are not being filled domestically. I mean, maybe we've got less builders now, so builders locally can charge more, but we're taking more doctors and nurses. But I mean, the fact that we are taking more from overseas, we're just not taking them from Europe now. We're taking them from further afield. So, nothing gained. Something ventured, nothing gained as far as Brexit's concerned.
Yeah, I mean, let's not get distracted into Brexit overall, but it's this. The interesting thing about opposition to migration, this is one of the problems we have, the level of racial tension that rises because of it. There's a wonderful study I remember reading from a book called The Political Economy of Australian Capitalism way back in the 30s with my old mentor, Ted Wheelwright, being the editor. And the academic from Macquarie University, Marie de Leprevache, I've never forgotten the name, did a wonderful study of political opposition to new waves of migration. And what she found was most of the opposition to the current wave of migration came from people who arrived in the previous wave of migration. And the reason being basically that meant that these people had got themselves into the country, whatever means or reason, become part of the society, put up with low wages in their own area, and now they saw the next wave of migrants as reducing the security they managed to get by migrating there in the first place. So it is one of these. You have to manage very carefully if you do wish to bring migration in. And for example, I think one of the best things ever done by the Australian Conservative Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser was to let all people who wish to be refugees from Kampuchea and Vietnam come to Australia, and that was both humanitarian on a grand scale, given the catastrophic damage Australia had helped cause in those wars by supporting America in the Vietnam War. But it also transformed the nature of Australian society, I think, in a way that you'd have to be a racist to be opposed to it, because the improvement in the culture and the food was off the scale. So, you just can't do it holus bolus. Otherwise, you give yourself problems both in assimilation of people and their acceptance into the community. But you also have to spend you should be spending an enormous amount on what's called capital broadening. You provide more schools, more roads, et cetera, rather than better schools, better roads. And there's a point where I think you are well past the point of, in this particular case, I hate to use the phrase, but I'll use it, diminishing returns, when the wave of migration is so great that you no longer devote money to improving the quality of your infrastructure. You devote it to expanding what you've currently got at the same standard.
Well, so that broadening argument, I mean, there is the argument that, a lot of the migrants that are coming in are complementary skills. They're doing jobs that wouldn't be done or certainly wouldn't be done for the price. and then arguably that frees up. I love that term that economists like to use. It frees up the ability for the people who have been made redundant by those lower paid workers coming in to do something else which pays better. Well, but then you could look at the whether you believe the unemployment statistics or not. Even with this high level of migration, there's the people claiming unemployment benefit in the UK. The unemployment rate is actually really very low, even though we know that there's a whole swag of people who are just choosing not to work for whatever reason, perhaps because they can.
Medically, because they can't.
Or medically, because they can't. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but but that complementarity, the fact that they're coming in and doing jobs that other people wouldn't do, that would be an argument for it, wouldn't it?
But at the same time, you just weakens the bargaining power of workers. The people who are coming in by and large are not billionaires. Okay, so what you have is a increase in the size of the labour force, which is a useful tactic for weakening the capacity of workers to bargain for wages across the entire spectrum of working class jobs and middle class jobs. So that's why the opposition, and this is where you get, in effect, what looks like a swing to the right by the working class occurs because the working class are the ones who are being threatened by this increase in migration numbers. And right-wing parties are very good at taking advantage of that and turning it to shift the country in many ways that undermine the same benefits those workers are hoping to get by cutting down the immigration. So it's an awful mess in the way it affects politics.
But in his defence, Rishi Sunak, and by the way, I don't think I've ever used those words in conjunction. In his defence, Rishi Sunak has been increasing the minimum wage, which seems like an easy fix for that problem.
It would be, yeah. It depends on how minimum the minimum wage is. The minimum wage in America is appalling. So I could say of the order of $8 when the people are campaigning for $15 an hour. And I look at the costs of living in London. I spent 4 years of my life there, and it's just struggled to survive on twice the minimum wage in London, maybe even 3 times. So the fact that these workers are then required to work in often the job they're going to get are going to be in that part of the world, but they therefore can't afford to have anything like decent accommodation. So
there should be a different one for London, shouldn't there? Well, there used to be a London allowance they used to get paid. So $11.44 is the answer to the question. That's how much they're increasing it, from $10.42 to $11.44 for workers over the age of 23. So it's better than the US, but probably not enough. Maybe it needs to be a great deal more. And of course, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So the one number that gets hidden, of course, in all of this is GDP. So, it's a very useful way of boosting GDP, isn't it? So exactly. The UK, IMF's forecast for 2023 for G7 countries has got 2.1% for the US, 0.5% for the UK. It was worse than that for the UK. It was sort of negative, just as they've been forecasting negative growth for Germany, which is almost certainly in a recession now. But 0.5%, OECD forecasts are 0.3%, so somewhere around that. But we've just had 750,000 people coming into the country. So per capita, obviously we are in a recession.
And that's happened. You get positive GDP numbers and negative GDP per capita.
So that's, but for a government that's not seeing any productivity growth, throwing more people at the problem obviously is an easy way to try and keep the economy growing.
And that's a similar thing being done in Australia right now as well. So I'm actually more interested in the long-term issues though on this, because population growth and what it does in general to the entire planet is another issue, which is something that's very fraught to talk about in global warming circles, but I think it needs to be discussed. And we've been doing limitless growth in the population. We're currently at 8 billion people on the planet. If you go back to 1972 when the limits to growth was written, I think it's roughly 3 billion people. So we've drastically increased the load we're putting per capita, however that's distributed, on the planet. And of course, over that 50-year period, we've effectively doubled the energy consumption per person. So we're using 6 to 8 times as much of the planet's reproducible capacity as we were back then, and I think that's one of the major issues we have to address.
So I wonder, and we'll address this when we come back after the break, but a question to leave you with. I wonder whether the fact that we are making it easier for people to migrate from developing nations to developed nations, in search of more money, whether we're actually adding to that population growth. Is that, would things level off a bit if we had less of this migration happening around the world? Question for you when we come back. It is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So we are asking the question this week, are there too many people on the planet? And Steve, I mean, the idea that if you are in a poor country and you are struggling to get by, that, the father in the family can shoot off overseas, or the mother, somebody who can find a job in the UK or some other developed nation and send a bit of money back home, then, that's a way out of, the situation you find yourself in. You might have a bigger family. It might add to population growth. Is this migration that we're seeing around the world, is that just adding to the global population, do you think?
I actually want to take a slightly different tack here, because everybody's talking about migrating from poor countries to rich countries. But if you remember, you ever see the movie The Day After Tomorrow?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a breakdown of the AMOC. The top half of America becomes uninhabitable. And who were the migrants and where did they go? The migrants were American. They went to Mexico.
That's the one. That was the movie where we saw an ocean liner going down the streets of New York, I seem to remember.
That's right, because what you had was, it was actually based on quite good science until they did the Hollywood special effects stage. So the idea of the decline in the AMOC suddenly meaning that heat distribution systems breaks down. That's all quite correct. We are potentially facing that. And then what they did was, of course, it's Hollywood, and so instantly there were two gigantic, and I mean, absolutely gigantic hurricanes that transferred enormous amounts of cold air from the stratosphere down to ground level and froze New York. It was after the boat sailed up the street. So. But we are going to face something of that nature quite possibly. And all the talk about what climate change is going to do and all these migrants are going to come from the poor countries to the rich, it could easily be the other way around. Yeah. And therefore, we're
not seeing that happening yet, of course, are we?
No, not yet, but we could.
So Americans moving to Mexico. Well, I mean, they're in Florida. It's only a short.
I think Britain's moving to Uganda is equally possible, because if we do have a breakdown in food distribution systems, if you talk to climate scientists, the each way bet they're making about what's going to be the first absolutely undeniable global catastrophe would be either a global food famine by wiping out essential, particularly grain crops, or a wet bulb catastrophe. Now, you're not likely to see the wet bulb catastrophe in the UK, even though you got 40-degree temperatures last summer.
But how much of that climate change and that need for food is being driven by just the sheer size of the world's population, and then the UK's issue is going to be the size of meeting the domestic need for food with an increasing population, of which many are coming from overseas. So, I'm looking at the IMF in 2020. They, in their World Economic Outlook, they had a chapter on the macroeconomic effects of global migration. They say immigration in advanced economies makes up 12% of the population, which is up from 7% in 1990. In other economies, migrants are only about 2% of the population. So, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, okay, as you're saying, the drift might turn the other direction with climate change. But right now, these are real numbers about what's happening now. So 12% of the population in advanced economies are people coming from elsewhere. People tend to think, by the way, that migration's twice that level. There's this psychological belief that migration is actually twice as bad as it really is. But they're saying, the 1% increase in the inflow of migration will result in a 1% increase in economic output by the fifth year. And their reasoning is about 2/3 of this increase is attributed to an increase in labour productivity. The remaining 1/3 of employment growth, which is, they say, borderline insignificant. An increase in total factor productivity matches the rise in labour productivity. As the capital stock responds immediately to the higher employment and productivity, the capital labour ratio rises. When breaking down total employment growth into its components, the analysis does not detect any effect on the aggregate growth of native employment. So productivity increases, presumably because, a chunk of that will be because people are getting paid less and working harder. And the employment remains the same for natives because they reckon they're the ones who are taking those complementary tasks in occupations which are going to pay them better. So as far as they're concerned, for the receiving nation, it's all looking good. It's helping GDP growth. It's not impacting employment in any way. And it's driving greater investment. That's what they reckon. It doesn't feel like that's what's happening, though, does it?
It reminds me, do you remember old Piggy Muldoon from New Zealand?
Yeah.
Okay, when he was asked about what he thought about the level of migration of young New Zealanders to Australia, he answered it improves the average IQ of both countries. I think it's one of the best put-downs ever in politics. But this will be seen as a positive by conventional economists because they have a ridiculous attitude to what they call labour productivity, which when you look at it properly is actually an increase in the energy processing capacity of the machines we're building. Yeah. And if you're not building better machines, you're not getting better productivity at all. You're just, again, you're tilting the playing field in favour of capitalists against workers. But so also, I'm not too convinced by that analysis.
So, no, I thought you wouldn't be. But what about the countries where those migrants are leaving from as well? So if you do say, well, OK, it's good for the productivity and for the growth in the economy of those receiving nations, what about the countries that they're leaving? Who's filling their nursing jobs? How are their economies going to grow?
Yeah.
You know, how does anyone with any ambition help the economy get any better?
And that's why a lot of developing countries don't like the out-migration that's occurring. And it means they train staff, doctors and nurses get trained in, let's say Bhutan would be a good choice for a very low-wage country, or India, and bang, they get on. They then migrate to the UK, where they get, even though the pay is low, it's still better than they'd get back in parts of India. So it's undermining the development capability of the third world as well.
And if you allowed for the development of the third world, you'd see, evidence of history shows as countries become more developed, population growth slows. So we would be doing good for the planet by doing that.
Yeah.
Although their energy consumption would also go up, of course. So that's not such a good thing.
Well, that's happened dramatically in China. I mean, I keep on thinking, having been to China in 81, 82, and walking through Shanghai and seeing the other side of the Bund River being basically rice paddies, and then going back and seeing it in the 2010s, 2018, I think was the last time I went there. You've got these incredible skyscrapers. Anybody who was 20 years old or more in 1982, they're about 60 now, has seen the most dramatic improvement there in the quality of life they're experiencing, certainly in terms of energy consumption. And that's the large reason why they'll be politically predisposed towards the Communist Party as rulers, because they've seen such dramatic improvement in their own lifetimes. Now, of course, that meant that you don't get much out-migration out of China, except for those who are getting away from the political issues in China. So that massive development means you lose that outflow of well-trained but low-wage workers from the third world to the first.
So, I mean, we should be encouraging that then, perhaps. Although then, but why would the West do that? Because they are benefiting from all these low-paid workers. But then we get these low-paid workers or lower-paid workers coming into the country, and then it upsets the apple cart a little bit because normally we haven't got the services to support them. So Migration Watch, which is a UK lobby group, the fact it's called Migration Watch obviously means that they don't like migration. I mean, there's not a group called Migration Watch because they want to see more. They say there were nearly 700,000 new GP registrations by migrants in the year 2019 to 2020. And immigration requires a new home to be built in England every 5 minutes to meet the skyrocketing demand. I mean, it takes more than 5 minutes to build a house. That's ridiculous. So that, I mean, that demand, that pressure on essential services is part of the problem, isn't it? But actually, that's not the problem. That's not the problem of the migrants. That's the problem of the government not providing the services to meet the population. I mean, they know how fast the population is growing, you would assume.
You would assume. Yeah, assume stands for make an ass out of you and me.
Well, we don't. I mean, in Britain, we don't actually, because we don't actually count how many people leave the country. Most countries.
You don't plan anything in Britain. I mean, the only thing you plan is the next press release.
Yeah.
This is just ridiculous. So, Britain's bringing its problems well and truly upon itself. But like, again, this is my point, the anti-migrant attitude, which let's not praise Rishi Sunak now, he's feeding into it, even though he's causing the intake, he's feeding into that as an electoral campaign. This could, sending people to sending asylum seekers. Where was it? Which country did they chosen to try to dump them into?
Rwanda. Yeah, they're trying to send them to Rwanda. He's not having a great deal of success with that, though. I mean, there's lots of court challenges against that. But I mean, the idea that, that's going to solve, supposedly a deterrent to stop people coming here, which of course it won't have any effect whatsoever. But
my worry is, and just, when there's, and I think it's going to be a case of not if, but when there's a breakdown in global food, Britain will be absolutely exposed, because Britain imports at least 30% of the food for the population. So you're suddenly going to find you're going to have people who want to leave England to go where there's food. Yeah. And in the level of racism that's been part of this campaign, boosting migration while using migrants and asylum seekers as political cannon fodder will backfire massively when people want to migrate from, say, not being kicked out as asylum seekers to Rwanda, they're going back as food seekers to Rwanda. Yeah. So they're going to get a very warm reception. Aside
from all of that, about the issue about food security becoming more of an issue, I mean, right now, just the fact that so much has to be imported to meet the demands of the population as it is, adding 750,000 in a year just makes that issue worse, even before you start to look at the impact of climate change. But what if you stop migration? If you got down to, so David Cameron famously said that he wanted to get net migration down to tens of thousands, which, is where we are. It's just the 75 tens of thousands. The natural population growth, as you mentioned, so births minus deaths, is about 70,000 for England and Wales. Don't know what Scotland's on. They also make babies in Scotland, I understand. I don't know what the numbers are there, but possibly more, because the men wear kilts, so they're ready for it whenever they need to. But,
Scottish subscribers.
70,000 a year, 0.1% growth rate. How does an economy grow with a population growth rate like that, unless you have a massive spike in productivity, which we're not getting, of course?
Well, for a start, we've got to come back to whether it's a good idea to grow or not. But what you do is you develop your technology. Yeah. Because what we call labour productivity, as I said before, is actually the increase in the energy processing capacity of the machinery. That's what it gives you the productivity. It's not labour productivity at all. People working harder. It's working with smarter machines. So that's where you put your time. You go Swiss rather than going English.
Right. But there's two types of jobs, aren't there? There's jobs which are geared towards productivity, looking after those machines. Who gave that classic quote? There's a machine only needs, once you've got a machine that's running things for people, you only really need one man to do the job. Or what is it? One man and a dog, isn't it? The dog, the man is there to man the machine, and the dog is there to make sure the man doesn't touch anything. That's because the machine just does everything for you. But so you've got productive jobs there, which are helping the economy grow. But increasingly, and I'm not quite sure how this relates to productivity, you got the jobs there which are basically maintaining welfare. So you've got José Luis Escrivá, who's Spain's minister responsible for migration. He reckons that the EU needs 50 million people in the next 25 years to stabilise its population, given the demographic trends that they're having. And there's an absolute need for this simply to maintain the welfare state. So, and there's nothing productive about increasing the welfare state, increasing healthcare, because that's not, you're not curing people's illnesses faster. It's hard to show that in in those GDP numbers. So how do you get greater productivity when you've got an increasing number of people who are simply there to maintain the welfare state and make sure people stay healthy?
Well, there are elements of the welfare state which involve high levels of technology too. You go for an MRI. That's a major piece of technology investment, and if you catch illnesses well before they develop, then you need less nurses in palliative care and so on. So there's ways in which service is not entirely a zero-sum game in terms of productivity gains. But again, this none of this thinking is what's driving current politics. And to me, you're seeing other elements of the social system get in the way as well. And so I see so many, when new migrant populations are developing, their own schools as established, same for religious groups and so on. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, you used to have pretty much a public schools system, and that was it. Public meaning public in the American sense, not the British sense of highly wealthy private schools. And therefore, you had social mixing between groups, and that broke down the level of racism. And that's not happening now again. So, migration, which in terms of experiencing different cultures and enriching some parts of the world by bringing in, say, for example, tasty food, that this is being ruined by the fact we're allowing social division, also part of the whole privatisation push.
Well, so division also
comes...
an
unholy mess.
Yeah, but social division comes when people are poor, doesn't it? When people are struggling to make the cost of living sort of work out, so they have to blame it on somebody. So that's where you start to get social division. I mean, there's lots of studies showing that is exactly what we're going through right now. And if we didn't have that, maybe people would get along better, and the attitude towards migration would be better. But do we want more migration? 750,000 is obviously a lot. We possibly don't want to get down to the point where it's just natural population growth, because that is too slight. But I mean, do we have a handle on what would be a good number? Or should we keep it at a minimum and just be focusing on helping those nations where these people are coming from, so that they can make a decent living and help those economies grow? That seems like an eminently more sensible way forward, doesn't it?
I'm afraid this is where my focus on global warming comes in, and I think we've got probably about 4 times as many humans as we should have on the planet. And
so, what are you proposing we do, Steve? How do we just?
We're going to do it the hard way, as humans always do. And if we're lucky, it just stops at 2 billion in that process. But a large part of the reason we can support so many people is the Haber-Bosch process, Haber-Bosch, I think it's called, by which we produce nitrogenous fertilizer using fossil fuels. Now, if that technology hadn't been developed, there's been plenty of good estimates by scientists that the population carrying capacity in terms of our food production would have peaked at 2 billion people. And instead we've gone to 8 billion people, but of course that's dependent upon continuing to produce artificial fertilizers to produce that amount of food. Now, because of global warming, carbon dioxide, fossil fuels, et cetera, and then also the potential catastrophes from climate change, that process may be forcibly terminated in one way or the other, and then we go back to the natural carrying capacity of the planet for humans rather than one we've artificially generated out of fossil fuels, which is 8 billion.
Right, but so
I'm a cheerful bastard on this one.
So what's the tipping point in all of that? When does suddenly a large slice of the population suddenly disappear? And can't we gear ourselves towards it, like, for example, by, I don't know, population control measures, or, as I said earlier, if we help the emerging nations to develop faster, then their population growth is going to slow, isn't it? And if we at the same time are saying, well, let's not take new migrants in, let's somehow manage to operate the welfare state domestically by whatever means, in terms of how we tip the balance of the economy, and maybe we need to reinforce the strength of unions to achieve that, then everyone wins ultimately in that, don't they?
Well, yeah, it's a winning hand if we're at the right table. I think we're at the wrong table. So, my expectation is when global warming starts to really bite, you're going to get food-producing surplus nations hanging on to what they have rather than exporting it, and telling importing nations to go jump, and then you're going to get attempts to migrate to the quite potentially catastrophic approaches to migration, waves of people in the current Mexican-American border sense, not the sort of applying for a visa situation we're talking about here. That'll be catastrophic, and the only sensible response, unfortunately, will be to do what right-wingers are arguing for now and close the borders. Because you're going to have a society surviving what we're going through. They have to fundamentally be able to provide food for their own people, and it'll be the countries that have that food-producing capacity who have the capability to do it. One of them happens to be the Netherlands, which is partly the reason why I bought a house here. The UK is not one. And that's what I think.
But the Netherlands is only self-sufficient in food because they're spending an enormous amount on energy, heating greenhouses to grow.
That's a large part of it. Yeah, they're going to have an issue when
part of the problem.
they don't produce their own oil. They've got, don't imagine they've got the North Sea oil crop, but we're likely to increase our use of carbon dioxide generating fuels when these catastrophes start happening, rather than reducing them. But in that transition, the countries that have got a potential to hang together are those that have produced a food surplus, and it is the Netherlands. It certainly isn't the UK.
All right. Look, if you want a happier life, just always turn off before the last 5 minutes of these podcasts. That's probably. I mean,
I always get my little kick in, don't I? Yeah.
You'll be blissfully ignorant, but somewhat happier. Look, just as an aside, I was used ChatGPT a few times this week just to see how much it can get things wrong, which is worrying. I mean, just double check anything that you get ChatGPT to do for you. But I thought, I don't know why it said, "Would you like us to write a limerick about you?" And I thought, no, I'd like you to write a limerick about Steve Keen. So this is a chat. Okay. Yeah, there once was an economist called Keen whose critiques of neoclassics were much seen. He's post-Keynesian, you see, and his work's quite a spree. Debunking economics, his routine.
It's not bad, actually.
Yeah. So there's poets. There's another job gone.
Well, tell you what, I've thought of a cartoon which I've suggested to my good mate Miguel Guerra to actually create. But if Miguel doesn't have the time, I might see if we can get the visual version of ChatGPT to produce the cartoon I'd like to have circulating. So.
Right.
At least there's some applications for AI.
Exactly. Yeah. In this case, completely useless, but there we are. But good to talk. We'll talk to you again next week. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, mate. Bye.
And we're hoping to get Yanis Varoufakis on the podcast sometime soon as well. He said yes, just got to find out the time in his busy schedule. So hopefully, next couple of weeks we'll have that. That's it for this week, though. I'm Phil Dobby, back with Steve again next week. Thanks for listening.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.